Savitri and Mantra, a study. Sri Aurobindo's long poem, Savitri, a Legend and a Symbol, is often spoken of as a mantra of spiritual transformation. And this is very true. And yet, what this actually means may not be adequately understood, even by devotees, and especially not by the literary establishment, which to this day seems unaware of its existence. Least of all is it known as a great epic poem, in the category with Dante, Milton, or Vyasa, although, along with them, its substance is basically philosophical, religious, spiritual, and mystical. The reason for this is perhaps because its style and substance are mantric. And this is a category that is unknown to the literary establishment. In order to understand Savitri, therefore, we must understand what is meant by mantra. I do not wish to suggest that we should try to understand Savitri in the conventional sense of an intellectual understanding of the poem, because its purpose is to invoke in us a much higher intuitional and spiritual understanding. But I will suggest that for this to be realized by us, it is important that we understand what constitutes a mantra, which is to say, what it requires from the reader, what mantra requires from the reader, and how this may be something other than what is required in order to understand poetry in the conventional sense. It is also necessary for us to understand how the term mantra may be understood differently in other traditions or in a conventional sense, which may not necessarily help us understand and receive the full benefit of Savitri. I would suggest that Sri Aurobindo wrote the book titled The Future Poetry precisely for these reasons. In the first 5 chapters of the first section of the book, he defines what he means by the term mantra. And in the 13 chapters of the second section, he elaborates the term and the importance that he gives to it. In addition, he wrote a third section 20 years later in which he explained the application of the term to the English language in the technical sense in which he was applying it to the writing of Savitri. This was written at a time when he was well into that writing. Furthermore, we are told by the Sri Aurobindo Ashram Archives, which has produced the definitive edition of his complete works, that he revised 20 chapters of the book in the last year of his life, which we should take as an indication of the importance he gave to this work. It is for this reason that I would like to undertake a brief study of both the poem Savitri and Sri Aurobindo's theory of mantra in the future poetry, as two closely related yet distinct areas of focus in his work. I consider this undertaking to be essential to achieving the full benefit of Savitri for those of us who are committed to Sri Aurobindo's yoga of transformation and his mantra, Savitri. The Vedic conception. In the first chapter of the Future Poetry, circa 1920, Sri Aurobindo writes, quote, "Casting our view farther back into the past, we may try to sound what the future has to give us through the medium of the poetic mind and its power for creation and interpretation. The issues of recent activity are still doubtful, and it would be rash to make any confident prediction, but there is one possibility which this book strongly suggests, and which it is at least interesting and may be fruitful to search and consider. That possibility is the discovery of a closer approximation to what we might call the mantra in poetry. That rhythmic speech, which, as the Veda puts it, rises at once from the heart of the seer and from the distant home of the truth. The discovery of the word, the divine movement, the form of thought proper to the reality. And in the third chapter, he gives this copious definition. The mantra, poetic expression of the deepest spiritual reality, is only possible when three highest intensities of poetic speech meet and become indissolubly one. A highest intensity of rhythmic movement, a highest intensity of interwoven verbal form and thought substance, and a highest intensity of the soul's vision of truth. All great poetry comes about by a unison of these three elements. It is the insufficiency of one or another which makes the inequalities in the work of even the greatest poets. And it is the failure of some one element which is the cause of their lapses, of the scoriae in their work, the spots in the sun. But it is only at a certain highest level of the fused intensities that the mantra becomes possible. But it is only at the highest level of the fused intensities that the mantra becomes possible. End of quote. Page 19. While each of these characteristics of great poetry gets substantial attention and elaboration in the course of the work, and easily provides us with criteria that would significantly impact our assessment of most of the poetry that we read today, it is the first intensity with which he is most concerned in qualifying poetry as mantra. This first intensity of rhythmic movement is something that he has written many chapters about. And it is this aspect which we may tentatively identify as the one which is the most difficult for both general readers and literary experts to recognize. Sri Aurobindo describes it vividly and frequently throughout this work. For example, in the second chapter he writes, quote, "The rhythmic word has a subtly sensible element, its sound value, a quite immaterial element, its significance or thought value, and both of these, again, its sound and its sense." The rhythmic movement has these two values, its sound and its sense. Separately and together, a soul value, a direct spiritual power, which is infinitely the most important thing about them. The sole value of the sound and sense of the rhythmic movement. And though this comes to birth with a small element subject to the laws of technique, yet almost immediately, almost at the beginning of its flight, its power soars up beyond the province of any laws of mechanical construction. And this form of speech carries in it, on its summits, an element which draws close to the empire of the ineffable. The perfection of this sound movement and style come entirely as the spontaneous form of his soul that utters itself in an inspired rhythm and an innate, a revealed word. Even as the universal soul created the harmonies of the universe out of the power of the word, secret and eternal within him. End of quote, page 13. While the style and substance of such poetry and its intuitive and visionary character become the main focus of several chapters in the second section of the book, here in the beginning of the exposition, stress is put on the sound value and rhythm. Another example in the first paragraph of the fourth chapter, quote, "Rhythm is the premier necessity of poetical expression." Rhythm is the first necessity of poetical expression because it is the sound movement which carries on its wave the thought movement in the word. And it is the musical sound image which most helps to fill in, to extend, subtleize, and deepen the thought impression, or the emotional or vital impression, and to carry the sense beyond itself into an expression of the intellectually inexpressible. Always the peculiar power of music. End of quote, page 25. This aspect of sound quality is greatly emphasized in the third section, where his focus is on the poetic technique of quantitative meter, which he found to be most essential for achieving mantric intensity in English, which he described as, in one place, quote, "the powerful sweep, the divine rush, or the assured truth of tread of that greater word music," and, quote, "that atmosphere of the unexpressed reality of the thing itself, which it is in the power of rhythm, of word music, as of all music, to create." The reason that we may find this quality of mantric poetry difficult to read or to hear, and which we may have had little opportunity ever to experience, has been explained by Sri Aurobindo in some detail. For example, he writes, quote, "Ordinary speech uses language mostly for a limited practical utility of communication. It uses it for life and for the expression of ideas and feelings necessary or useful to life. In doing so, we treat words as conventional signs for ideas with nothing but a perfunctory attention to their natural force. I would make an exception to this comment of Sri Aurobindo by referring to some social and geographical areas of the planet where people don't read very much and still use language to really communicate. And they speak all the time and very vibrantly to each other, even at close distances. And they do not fall into a trance of circumspection while they're speaking. They expect to be heard. So there are people who still communicate like that, but not in the West, and not since a few hundred years of mainly using language to communicate everyday realities in a most perfunctory way. Indians still speak a lot, very loud to each other. If you go into a village and listen to an old guy, a shriveled old guy sitting on his porch talking to his neighbor, you can hear him a half a mile away. And he is really communicating his innermost feelings. He's not communicating some vague ideas that he thinks you will already understand and assume, so that you only have to say a few words and then you can assume that the other person knows what you're talking about. We often don't even finish our sentences because we think that the person we're talking to will already know what we're talking about before we even say it. So we communicate like this all the time, but our main problem is that we get most of our knowledge from reading. And we have been taught from an early age to make this silent association between the printed word and the thought. And we never really have never really learned in school to use language to really communicate unless we've studied drama or something like that. What we're supposed to do is read the text and write a summary of the text, which anybody can understand without having read the text, because it just basically says the same thing that everybody has already read. So the use of language in the Western world, especially for the last 200 or 300 years, has been very much text-oriented. And you are respected more if you speak quietly and subtly and very rapidly. So you can go to a university lecture and you'll hear somebody going on and on and on so fast that you can hardly follow what they're saying if you don't already know what it is. So that's what I mean. We have gone through a language mind development in Western society in the last few hundred years that has reduced us to a kind of mental transcriptional thinking process, code. And it's even worse today because we aren't even aware of the code that has been written, in which the few things that we read have been made to appear on the screen of our computers, and then we move quickly on to some other text, and then some other text, and then some other text, and we don't have to even do the thinking that's required to understand and produce such things.
Yeah, but that's normal. That's regular, quote unquote, regular people. What about poets?
Well, I've mentioned here that the average reader
even
will will not have the sensitivity to language that the poet has, but even the poet's sensitivity is based upon these few hundred years of written text. Yeah.
Just make a comment. If you think of Shakespeare, all of his plays have dialogues with chunks of incredible passages that rhyme and have a profound sense embedded and have a rhythm and all of that. So, and it was like that even in the ancient Indian epics. The characters, when they communicate, they talk in speeches in Sanskrit with rhymes and profound meaning and so on, and we think, how did they do that back then?
Well, I'm not sure that people spoke that way, but the reason I'm trying to ask this question, because you were talking that the people who do not read or not literate can communicate but very loudly, and I was
effectively.
And what are they communicating? That they're hungry, or you feel that for some reason?
I was thinking about politics, for example. These people are really, the people who have their feet on the ground and who are not particularly literate share ideas about politics. They don't depend upon media to give them the ideas. They are engaged in the political realities of their lives in a very energetic way through language, and they depend upon listening to somebody on their soapbox, making them aware of things in a way that makes a difference to them. So they're still engaged. If you go to a university, I've been to many in India, where some scientist is speaking about something, or some sociologist, or some mathematician, and it's like listening to political oratory. They are really communicating to their audience from the throat center. They're making this thing vibrate. And so when we think about the sound quality, the rhythmic movement of sound that is meant to convey the soul of the reality of something to the mind, we're not thinking about explaining something to the mind which it can understand intellectually. We're thinking about making it feel something, the way music does.
Okay, I got it now.
So then Sri Aurobindo is the one who is saying this, by the way. In this quote he says, "We live still in an age which is in a great intellectual trouble and ferment about life and the world, and is developing enormously the human intelligence, often at the expense of other powers, which are no less necessary to self-knowledge. In order to grapple with life and master it, we use the intellect." I'm quoting from Sri Aurobindo. "We are seeking always and in many directions to decipher the enigma of things, the cryptogram of the worlds which we are set to read and to decipher by the aid of the intellect. And for the most part, we are much too busy living and thinking to have leisure to be silent and see. We treat words as conventional signs for ideas with nothing but a perfunctory attention to their natural force, the natural force of words. We think about their abstract meaning, which we should know instantly. And we're not thinking about how to use speech effectively to communicate the inner realities of things We're not even interested in the inner realities of things. We just want the superficial, quick bite, and we know enough.
Cocktail chat.
Much as we use any kind of common machine or simple implement, we treat them as if, though useful for life, they were themselves without life. Words. They're not a product of our souls, they're the product of our tongues, which are translating in accentuated speech what our little intellect is thinking. And it's only thinking what it's most recently been experiencing. It's not really thinking about ideas. This is relevant for Savitri, I'm continuing the quote. When we wish to put a more vital power into them, we have to lend it to them out of ourselves. Try to, by marked intonations of the voice. So people sometimes read Savitri like this. They try to impose by the intonation of their voice some dramatic meaning to the words, and they don't realize that the words themselves are the thing. If someone like Sri Aurobindo is using them, we don't have to impose any meanings on them. We just have to be able to hear the meanings that he's communicating. So this requires a kind of devotion to the power of the word of the Master, which we don't have time to give to anybody normally. To surrender to the meaning that is already there in the words, without trying to think about it and interpret it. Sri Aurobindo says, we throw some emotional force into the sound so as to infuse into the conventional word sign something which is not inherent in itself. So I'm reading some quotations that seem to me to explain why we may not really understand and relate to what he calls mantra. He has given us some clues about how we treat language, even in literature, in a way that is different than the way the Vedic poets in that era of sound transmission used language. He says, the poetic vision, like everything else, follows necessarily the evolution of the human mind, and according to the age and environment, it has its ascents and descents, its high levels and its low returns. Ordinarily, it follows the sequence of an abrupt ascent pushing to a rapid decline. A vital poetry, appealing to the imagination through the sense mind and the emotions, and a poetry interpretative of life to the intelligence, are the fruit of these intellectual ages. A later poetry tends always to return on these forms with a more subtilized intellect and a richer life experience. But having got so far, it can go no farther, and there is the beginning of a decadence. Quote, page 38. If we think about the poetry we have probably read in our lifetime, from Whitman and T.S. Eliot to Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder, we can probably relate to this assessment. My daughter, now in her 30s, is a published poet, and I do not see much difference in hers and her contemporaries' poetry 50 years after Ginsberg and Snyder. Except perhaps in the subtlety and richness of life experience. I would like to introduce a bit later these criteria offered by Sri Aurobindo, applied to the poetry of our time. And of course there are other criteria that can be applied. Social and psychological and political. And we can easily compare substance, the style and substance, the rhythmic movement in the poetry of our time with, for example, the poetry of Shelley and Keats, or the poetry of Sri Aurobindo. And we can achieve a more vivid relationship with these categories and what they mean. But for the moment, what I would like to do is turn to the poetry of Savitri and see what we can hear.
Can we get a short break?
Then suddenly there came a downward look, as if a sea exploring its own depths. A living oneness widened at its core and joined him to unnumbered multitudes. A bliss, a light, a power, a flame-white love caught all into a soul immense embrace. Existence found its truth on oneness's breast. And each became the self and space of all. The great world rhythms were heartbeats of one soul. To feel was a flame discovery of God. All mind was a single harp of many strings. All life a song of many meeting lives. For worlds were many, but the self was one. This knowledge now was made a cosmos's seed. This seed was cased in the safety of the light. It needed not a sheath of ignorance. Then, from the trance of that tremendous clasp, and from the throbbings of that single heart, and from the naked spirit's victory, a new and marvelous creation rose. incalculable outflowing infinitudes, laughing out an unmeasured happiness, lived their innumerable unity. Worlds where the being is unbound and wide, bodied unthinkably the egoless self. Rapture of beatific energies, join time to the timeless, poles of a single joy. White vasts were seen where all is wrapped in all. There were no contraries, no sundered parts. All by spiritual links were joined to all, and bound indissolubly to the one. Each was unique, but took all lives as his own. And, following out these tones of the infinite, recognized in himself the universe. A splendid center of infinity's whirl, pushed to its zenith's height, its last expanse, felt the divinity of its own self-bliss, repeated in its numberless other selves. It took up tirelessly into its scope persons and figures of the impersonal, as if prolonging in a ceaseless count, in a rapturous multiplication sum, the recurring decimals of eternity. None was apart. None lived for himself alone. Each lived for God in him and God in all. Each soulness inexpressibly held the whole. Their oneness was not tied to monotone. It showed 1,000 aspects of itself. Its calm, immutable stability upbore on a changeless ground, forever safe, compelled to a spontaneous servitude, the ever-changing, incalculable steps, the seeming reckless dances, subtle plan of immense world forces in their perfect play. Appearance looked back to its hidden truth, and made of difference oneness's smiling play. It made all persons fractions of the unique, yet all were beings secret integers. All struggle was turned to a sweet strife of love in the harmonized circle of a sure embrace. Identity's reconciling happiness gave a rich security to difference. On a meeting line of hazardous extremes, the game of games was played to its breaking point. There, where through self-finding by divine self-loss, there leaps out unity's supreme delight, whose blissful undivided sweetness feels a communality of the absolute. There was no sob of suffering anywhere. Experience ran from point to point of joy. Bliss was the pure, undying truth of things. All nature was a conscious front of God. A wisdom worked in all, self-moved, self-sure, a plenitude of illimitable light, an authenticity of intuitive truth, a glory and passion of creative force. Infallible, leaping from eternity, the moment's thought inspired the passing act. A word, a laughter sprang from silence's breast. A rhythm of beauty in the calm of space. A knowledge in the fathomless heart of time. All turn to all without reserve's recoil. A single ecstasy without a break. Love was a close and thrilled identity in the throbbing heart of all that luminous life. A universal vision that unites, a sympathy of nerve replying to nerve, hearing that listens to thought's inner sound and follows the rhythmic meanings of the heart. A touch that needs not hands to feel, to clasp. Were there the native means of consciousness, and heightened the intimacy of soul with soul. A grand orchestra of spiritual powers, a diapason of soul interchange, harmonized a oneness deep, immeasurable. In these new worlds projected, he became a portion of the universal gaze, a station of the all-inhabiting light, a ripple on a single sea of peace. His mind answered to countless communing minds. His words were syllables of the cosmos's speech. His life a field of the vast cosmic stir. He felt the footsteps of a million wills moving in unison to a single goal. A stream ever newborn that never dies, caught in its thousandfold current's ravishing flow. With eddies of immortal sweetness thrilled, he bore, coiling through the members as they passed, calm movements of interminable delight. The bliss of a myriad myriads who are one. So let's turn to the second essential aspect of mantric poetry that Sri Aurobindo termed its thought substance, or meaning. The meaning that the mantra wants to communicate to us. Sri Aurobindo often emphasizes two terms that define these essential characteristics of mantra: sruti and dristi. Hearing and seeing. They do not refer to the eyes and ears and their perceptions of sight and sound, but rather to a vision of the truth of things that comes into the consciousness of the hearer as a result of the rhythmic incantation of the mantra. And as we have heard, it is this rhythmic aspect of the mantra that carries the inspiration and transmits it to the hearer. He puts it like this in the first chapter of part 2 of the Future Poetry. What the Vedic poets meant by the mantra was an inspired and revealed seeing and visioned thinking, attended by a realization, to use the ponderous but necessary modern word, of some inmost truth of God and self and man and nature and cosmos and life and thing and thought and experience and deed. It was a thinking that came on the wings of a great soul rhythm, chandas. For the seeing could not be separated from the hearing. It was one act. Nor could the living of the truth in oneself, which we mean by realization, be separated from either. For the presence of it in the soul and its possession of the mind must precede or accompany in the creator or human channel that expression of the inner sight and hearing which takes the shape of the luminous word. The mantra is born through the heart and shaped or massed by the thinking mind into a chariot of that Godhead of the eternal, of whom the truth seen is a face or a form. And in the mind, too, of the fit outward hearer, who listens to the word of the poet-seer, these three must come together if our word is a real mantra. The sight of the inmost truth must accompany the hearing. The possession of the inmost spirit of it by the mind, and its coming home to the soul, must accompany or follow immediately upon the rhythmic message of the word and the mind's sight of the truth. Page 218. This brings us to the second essential aspect or intensity, which Sri Aurobindo referred to as the thought substance. It is what the rishi kavi has himself seen and heard and wants to convey to the hearer. This is not an ordinary perception, but something that is heard outwardly, that produces a seeing inwardly of realities other than what can be known by the intellect through sense perception and reason. This is a thought substance of another plane of reality. It is a vision seen by the soul. And in fact, he says, it is only a mantra if it brings about such an inspired vision and higher intuition. In other words, a direct knowing by the soul of the reality that is being formed and communicated by the rishi. Sri Aurobindo says, poetry is the mantra only when it is the voice of the inmost truth and is couched in the highest power of the very rhythm and speech of that truth. And the ancient poets of the Veda and Upanishads claimed to be uttering the mantra because always it was this inmost and almost occult truth of things which they strove to see and hear and speak, and because they believed themselves to be using or finding the innate soul rhythms and the sacrificial speech of it, cast up by the divine Agni, the sacred fire in the heart of man. The mantra, in other words, is a direct and most heightened and intensest and most divinely burdened rhythmic word, which embodies an intuitive and revelatory inspiration and ensouls the mind with the sight and the presence of the very self, the inmost reality of things, and with its truth, and with the divine soul forms of it. The Godheads which are born from the living truth. We might notice that the word truth, in this sense, refers to a reality that exists in itself, and the seeing and knowing of that reality itself. It doesn't refer to some judgment that's made by the intellect. And frequently throughout this work and Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, this distinction is made. And when he says that this is a truth consciousness, he means that it is the force of the reality that is received by the intuition. The higher intuition, which is not an intellectual faculty, becomes conscious of a force that is, in fact, the truth itself, being seen and known. At the time of writing this book, Sri Aurobindo seems to have been at least tentatively or cautiously hopeful that such poetry and such consciousness could possibly emerge as a cultural force in a more universally recognized form than it had been in past ages when it was occult and the privilege of the initiated. He says, for example, quote, "Now that we have seen minutely what is the material reality of the world in which we live, and have some knowledge of the vital reality of the force from which we spring, we are at last beginning to seek again for the spiritual reality of that which we and all things secretly are. Our minds are once more trying to envisage the self, the spirit of man and the spirit of the universe. Intellectually, no doubt, at first. But from that to the old effort at sight, at realization within ourselves and in all, is not a very far step. But if an age comes which is in common possession of a deeper and greater and more inspiring truth, then its masters of the rhythmic word will at least sing on a higher common level, and may rise more often into a fuller, intenser light, and capture more constantly the greater tones of which this harp of God, to use the Upanishad's description of man's created being, is secretly capable. Sri Aurobindo was tentative and cautious in making this prediction. And his statement is conditional upon the coming of an age no longer characterized by materialistic and rational thinking. It seems that 100 years later, things have not changed very much, either in human consciousness or in poetry. But we know that Sri Aurobindo wrote Savitri in exactly the vein of thought substance and intuitive vision that he was advocating, with the purpose of possibly bringing such an age closer. In other words, he saw the possibility that this type of mantric poetry could hasten the advent of such an age. He wrote, "A greater era of man's living seems to be in promise. Whatever nearer and earthier powers may be striving to lead him on a side path away to a less exalted ideal. And with that advent, there must come a new great age of his creation, different from the past epochs, which he counts as his glories, and superior to them in its vision and motive. But first there must intervene a poetry which leads him towards it from the present faint beginnings. It will be aided by new views in philosophy, a changed and extended spirit in science, and new revelations in the other arts, in music, painting, architecture, sculpture, as well as high new ideals in life and new powers of a reviving but no longer limited or obscurantist religious mind." Page 221. I assume that this reviving of a no longer obscurantist religious mind was what he intended Savitri to accomplish, to achieve, to whatever extent possible. And that by listening carefully to its inspired rhythms, we may discover something about the nature of that higher intuitive mind, which he believed to be in promise. In the future poetry, he stated several arguments concerning the difference between vitalistic truth, intellectual truth, and philosophical truth, and the thought substance that predominates in poetry and in philosophy today, and the thought substance of the higher intuitive vision of the inspired poet, the mantric poet. He spoke in many passages of, quote, the breath of greater life and the sun of poetic truth. In the chapter titled The Sun of Poetic Truth, we read, the intellectual, vital, sensible truths are subordinate things. The breath of poetry should give us, along with them, or it may even be apart from them, some more essential truth of the being of things, their very power, which springs in the last resort from something eternal in their heart. Hridaye Guhayam. The heart of the word and the seeing. The heart of things, the soul of things. Expressive even in the moments and transiences of life. The soul of the poet, and the soul too of the hearer, by a response to his word, enters into some direct contact through vision and straight touch and emotion, possesses and feels at its strongest by a union in our own stuff of being, a moved identity, a direct spiritual perception and vision, called by us intuition. If some kind of intuitive seeing is at the back of his imaginative vision, and the real power that calls down the inspired word, it will be when he can rise to its source and live in the fullness of a highest intuitive mind, which is greater than the awakened sense, intuitive life vision, or inspired reason, though it will see all that. It will see all that they can see. But he will get his fullest power, deepest sight, broadest scope through that highest intuitive mind. To throw light on the self of things, in some power and beauty of it, is after all the native aim of poetry, and that can be done entirely by this greatest intuitive mind. For it can bring near, or going beyond itself actually reach, the vision of identity, that seeing of our whole self and the self of the world, which is the last object and the highest spirit of all our mental powers and seekings. The poetry which will accomplish that will be able to see, though in another way, than that of philosophy and religion, the self of the eternal. To know God and His Godheads. To know the freedom and immortality which is our divinest aim. To see in the delight of a union in beauty the self of the infinite, the self of nature, and the whole self of man. But so to see the self is to meet the Spirit in everything. And the Spirit reveals to us the inner and the inmost truth of all that comes from it, life and thought and form and every image and every power. The Veda speaks in one of its symbolic hints of the fountain of eternal truth round which stand the illumined powers of thought and life. The Godheads that convey to us the meanings of things that exist through the existence of those things, seen with the intuitive mind. He says, there, under the eyes of delight and the face of imperishable beauty of the Mother of creation and Bride of the Eternal Spirit, they lead their immortal dance. The poet visits that marvelous source in his superconscient mind and brings to us some strain or some vision of her face. To find the way into that circle with the waking self is to be the seer poet. And to discover the highest power of the inspired word, the mantra. Pages 238, 239, and 240. Mantric poetry is poetry of the spirit. It is spiritual poetry. And it has the power to awaken in us the visionary power of the Spirit. Identification with the source of wisdom. Consciousness of the presence of the divine. Savitri can do this. Its thought substance is spiritual. And that also illustrate a kind of formal aspect of Savitri that corresponds, I think, to the idea of chandas. This rhythmic repetition that the eternal uses to bring about the forms of things that exist in time and space. There is a rhythmic pattern in everything that occurs in time and space, which gives things their meaning, or their purpose, or their identity. And Sri Aurobindo repeatedly suggests that the mantric poet is conveying that principle of rhythmic repetition that already exists in everything as its essential source. So what is being translated by the mantric poet into word and speech is the reality. It's not an abstraction. It's an attunement with the reality of existence. And that reality happens to be spiritual. So it's inevitable to conclude from a study of Savitri and the future poetry that this new age and this new mind that Sri Aurobindo is addressing throughout his works, all of his works, is on the one hand a kind of prophetic evolutionary thinking, and on the other hand it is a seeing of what already is the truth of things. And it's a great mystery to know, to think about, and perhaps to see how these two aspects, the temporal evolutionary thought forms and the atemporal existing reality of the spirit, are mutually related in what we know of, what we call time. Time itself is the mystery of this relationship between an evolutionary temporal reality and an atemporal, already existing reality. And in philosophy, both Eastern and Western philosophy, this interrelationship between the timeless and time is thought to be causal. If we could perceive that in its reality, then the value of everything in existence would be greatly heightened. Everything would be seen not in its deficiency, but in its moving towards actualization. And so that is a vision that underlies the patterns in Savitri that we read, that we hear. And it's no surprise that this mantric power and vision is not more widely appreciated because it is a power of vision and poetry that is not yet generally realized in the evolutionary structure of human consciousness. It requires a stepping out of the conventional patterns of our lives into another intensity of consciousness. And so when we listen to Savitri, it is that which we hope to hear and see and feel.